Millions of Filipinos pass through a train station with this name every single day. There are streets, markets, neighborhoods, but almost no one knows who he was. Ferdinand Blumentritt, an ordinary man who never visited the Philippines, not once, and yet he became the best friend and closest confidant of the Philippine national hero, José Rizal.
Blumentritt was exceptionally educated, deeply tolerant, and a man of great character.
This is historian Dr. Doskochil. He grew up in this exact city and spent decades researching a friendship that makes almost no logical sense. How do two men who never lived in the same country build an unbreakable brotherhood through 500 letters? Until one of them is executed. 10 years before his execution, José Rizal was not a national hero. He was 25 years old, far from home, living in Germany, and carrying a manuscript that Spain did not want anyone to read. For 3 centuries, the Philippines had suffocated under Spanish rule. The church held total control, and dissent was a danger no one could afford. Filipinos, branded Indios, were reduced to second-class citizens in their own land. Rizal set out to expose this systemic brutality through a single explosive novel. He named it Noli me Tángere, Touch Me Not. But Rizal knew a book alone wouldn't be enough. He needed European scholars, people with unassailable academic credibility, to validate his culture and tell the world that his fight was justified. He searched for weeks. He wrote to the leading Philippine experts across Europe, and every single one of them disappointed him.
The letter is polite, but he complains. He says he had contacted all the major Philippine experts in Europe, and he was always disappointed, because none of them had ever been to the Philippines. And he noticed that whenever a new expert took over, they simply copied from their predecessor, who also had never been there. He writes all of this to Blumentritt in that first letter, and he asks him, "Are you the same kind?"
On July 13th, 1886, the letter left Heidelberg, and in a small town near Prague, a schoolteacher opened it. While Rizal was writing letters to strangers who kept disappointing him, one schoolteacher in this city had already spent a decade collecting the one thing nobody around him valued. Behind a closed door in this house, after his students had gone home, Ferdinand Blumentritt built something nobody had asked him to build: the largest private archive on the Philippines outside of Spain itself. Maps of islands he had never seen. Grammars of languages no European school taught. He wasn't doing this for a university. He wasn't doing this for money. He was doing it because in a town constantly arguing about whose language and whose culture deserved to survive, he had quietly chosen to defend a culture nobody in Europe was even fighting over.
Blumentritt was not offended at all. He said he was looking forward to hearing from him.
And in the same reply, he admitted something most professors never would. He had never set foot in the Philippines. He never would. He was terrified of sailing. So terrified, he said, that even crossing the Elbe by boat made him uneasy, let alone an ocean. Rizal had spent weeks searching for someone who wouldn't lie to him. He had just found the only man in Europe who admitted, up front, to his own limits. Blumentritt wrote back within the same week. He enclosed 2 books. That should have been the end of a brief, polite exchange between a professor and a student. Over the next 11 months, 500 letters would cross the map. They stopped writing about academic footnotes. They started writing about colonial law, about liberty, about what it meant to be called an Indio in your own homeland by people who had never met you.
Blumentritt must have been an incredibly sensitive person. The things he allowed himself to do were simply tolerated here. That was by no means something to take for granted.
Rizal was telling this stranger things he couldn't tell his own family. A man he had never met.
I am beginning to suffer in my chest. and fear a grave illness because of the symptoms. When I was a young boy, the doctor at the Ateneo Municipal told me I was in the early stages of consumption.
300 kilometers away, had become the only person on earth he trusted completely. And then, in the spring of 1887, something changed everything. His first novel, the one that would make him an enemy of an empire, finally came off the printing press in Berlin. Rizal made a decision no letter could replace. He would go to Litoměřice. At exactly 1:30 in the afternoon, the Dresden Express pulled into the station. Blumentritt was there. So was his family. So were friends. They were waiting for one Filipino, not two.
When the express train from Dresden stopped here, not one, but two Filipinos stepped out. It was a complete surprise.
Rizal had brought Maximo Viola, the friend who had paid for Noli me Tángere when Rizal had almost burned it in Berlin. Without Viola, the novel might never have existed. Without the novel, there would be no reason for this meeting at all. Blumentritt took them straight into town, to the Hotel Krebs on the market square.
Now it's a mall, it's a supermarket, but in the past, Rizal was here for 3 days in room 12, a very historical place.
Rizal and Viola were impressed by the Czech food. They said it was better than German food, but the real test was still ahead. Because Blumentritt did not just want to feed Rizal. He wanted the town to understand him. So he brought him to speak.
They couldn't believe he wasn't German, because Rizal spoke without notes, without hesitation, engagingly and fluently in German. Everyone admired his command of the language. Rizal himself wasn't sure if his German was any good, since he had only been learning it for 9 months. When he told them that, they simply refused to believe him.
Rizal spontaneously spoke to a group of people about freedom and democracy in German, and the room applauded. But the most important moment of the visit happened away from the applause. One afternoon, Rizal walked along the Elbe with Robert Kluczak.
As he walked along the banks of the Elbe, suddenly he saw his own river.
That detail matters, because in Dapitan, years later, Rizal would write that when he was at his lowest, he remembered Litoměřice. He remembered this river. And in the bend of the Elbe, he saw something that reminded him of home. Before they left, Rizal and Viola signed the city guest book, in German.
And it's here. It's here. It's a
His signature
memorial book of the town Litoměřice. Yes?
So I can also signature now here?
I'm afraid not.
No, okay. Joy Ventures here would be nice, but okay. Yeah, interesting. He signatured in German. Aus Philippine, from Philippines. Viola. Viola also. That's interesting. Nice. He also signatured in German.
Rizal and Viola left Litoměřice. Blumentritt would never see him again. And yet, the friendship was only becoming stronger. The next morning, Rizal and Viola arrived in Prague, where they stayed for a few days. More than a century later, a bust of José Rizal was unveiled inside the Czech National Bank, on the site of the former Blue Star Hotel, where the two men had stayed in 1887. As Rizal moved further away, the shadow over his life grew darker. His first novel had made him dangerous in Spanish eyes. And from a distance, the tone of his letters to Litoměřice began to change. He was no longer just a student asking for academic validation. He was a man watching his country bleed. On July 3, 1887, Rizal boarded the steamship Gemna in Marseille, bound for Manila. He was leaving Europe alone after 5 years.
When the ship left the harbor, I was overcome by such sadness that tears came to my eyes. I was completely alone and no one took any notice of me. I watched the shores slowly disappear and my beautiful homeland recede into the distance as though swallowed by mist. Goodbye, Europe.
Rizal had lost his faith in peaceful reform, so he began writing a second novel, El Filibusterismo, a book far more dangerous, far more violent than the first. And before it was published, he asked his brother in Litoměřice for one monumental favor: to write the prologue to a different, equally dangerous project, a new annotated edition of a 300-year-old Spanish chronicle, Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, originally written in 1609. Blumentritt read the manuscript. He was not a radical. He was a conservative, practicing Catholic schoolteacher. He knew the Spanish authorities perfectly. When he first heard the word filibustero, subversive, years ago, he remembered the terror it struck in the hearts of the people. He knew instantly that to put his highly respected European name on this revolutionary book was to sign his best friend's death warrant. Saying yes meant making himself a target of the Spanish Empire, and saying no meant abandoning his friend at the exact moment the world was about to turn against him. Why did a peaceful European scholar agree to something so dangerous? Perhaps because he remembered another letter Rizal had written him years earlier.
We want the happiness of the Philippines, but we want to obtain it through noble and just means. If I have to commit villainy to make her happy, I would refuse to do so.
A man who writes sentences like that is not someone you abandon when the world gets dark. Blumentritt wrote the preface, addressing Rizal directly as a friend. He accused the friars and colonial officials of slandering him as a filibustero, and warned that continued oppression would not suppress rebellion, it would create it. And after that, he didn't hide. Year after year, from his desk in this small town, Blumentritt transformed himself into Rizal's fiercest defender. He wrote explosive articles for the Filipino exile newspaper La Solidaridad in Madrid. He translated Rizal's work into German. He fought an entire empire with nothing but ink and paper. But there are things you cannot protect another person from. The Spanish authorities arrested him almost immediately and exiled him to Dapitan. For 4 agonizing years, Blumentritt could do nothing but send letters across the ocean, hoping they would arrive. In August 1896, armed Filipinos rose against Spanish rule. Rizal was not among them. He was on a ship to Cuba, having volunteered as a military doctor for Spain. One last official attempt to prove his loyalty. But after the revolution broke out, the colonial authorities decided that loyalty no longer mattered. His ship was stopped. He was brought back in chains. The charges: rebellion, sedition, conspiracy. The evidence used to condemn him: his 2 novels, and a massive 10-year correspondence with a schoolteacher in Litoměřice. The verdict: execution by firing squad. On his very last evening on earth, sitting in a cold cell in Fort Santiago, Manila, Rizal wrote his final letters to his parents, to the people he was leaving behind at the age of 35. And then he wrote one final time to the man who had answered a letter from a stranger 10 years earlier, in German.
My dear brother, when you receive this letter, I shall be dead. Tomorrow at 7, I shall be shot. But I am innocent of the crime of rebellion. I die with a tranquil conscience. Farewell, my best, my dearest friend. Never think ill of me.
This letter to Leitmeritz, right before his execution, naturally carries a profound emotional weight. That line, "By the time you read this, I will already be dead." In a way, it's such a cold, chilling sentence, yet so incredibly powerful. True strength doesn't require grandiose words. It wouldn't have been surprising if he had, symbolically speaking, started to cry in that letter. But he doesn't. That is something I deeply respect.
Rizal started their correspondence as esteemed professor. He ended it as my dear brother. When the final letter reached Litoměřice, Blumentritt broke down. He had fought an empire with his pen, only to realize it wasn't enough to save the person he loved. But he didn't stop. Blumentritt defended the Philippines for 17 more years, until his death in 1913. Manila declared official mourning. A schoolteacher near Prague, who never set foot on their soil, mourned by an entire nation. Two men inextricably linked. One gave his life, the other gave his life's work. Revered in the Philippines, almost forgotten in Europe. Rizal once stood on this exact square, condemning the absolute evil of colonization. 50 years later, this very square would be renamed Adolf Hitler Platz, bringing death and destruction. But that is the story for the next video.
That is the kind of friendship it was. And for God's sake, I don't want these things to be forgotten.